Welcome everyone, Simon here from the Wales of Wall Street. We have an exciting interview video for you guys today, introducing Professor Sarah Green, the UK Commissioner for Common and Commercial Law. Very exciting topics coming up today. We'll talk a bit about the Electronics Trade Documents Act came into fruition towards the latter stage of last year, how the Commission, and particularly as well from Professor Sarah's perspective, influence the decisions behind these frameworks. And of course, as well, we'll be looking at the likes of real world or digital assets in general, or the physicality going into digital asset, and smart contracts aspects as well. All of these things that have frameworks and legislation that need to be built upon advice and consultancy like the commissioning aspect would prevail with. So it's a really exciting bunch of topics. I'm really excited to present this insight to you guys. It's absolutely fascinating conversation. So let's dive straight into this one, and we'll see you on the other side. Okay, guys, so absolutely delighted to have Professor Sarah Green on the channel here. So just a bit of a background, the Commissioner for Commercial and Common Law. Absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you, Sarah. It'd be great if you could do a brief introduction to yourself and a bit of a background would be awesome as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. I am, as you say, the current Commissioner for Commercial and Common Law at the Law Commission of England and Wales, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially means I'm in charge of looking at law reform in the commercial sphere for the jurisdiction of England and Wales. So I've been doing that this is my 5th year. And before that, I was a professor of law at the universities of Bristol and Oxford. And before that, I was a software developer. I was a coder at Accenture for a few years, which probably explains, well, no, I think it definitely does explain why I'm a lawyer who's also very, very interested in the technological aspects and implications of law reform. So I think that history probably explains why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
That is brilliant. You kind of answered my next question. I didn't know that part, which is absolutely fantastic. It totally hits the nail on the head as to why you're probably very passionate and dedicated to this particular area that we're going to be discussing. Of course, there's been a lot going on at the moment. It'd be good if you had maybe a bit of history before we go into the individual kind of topics. Kind of like the history of the law aspects of how these became conversations in the first place, particularly around like the DAO situations, the decentralized autonomous organizations, as well as the kind of like transformation in recent times of things that we're about to start talking about. I'm particularly interested because the Innovation Hub was created not too many years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I know it was a formulation of Rishi Sunak at the time, who was really heavily forefronting this. What's kind of led us to this position at the moment, and to why we need to start looking at the digitalization and bringing that into a law aspect as well?
Yeah, I think it's easy to look back, I think, on the past decade and answer that question. I think it's become easier as the years have gone by. And I think I often describe it as a perfect storm, really, a perfect storm with, positive benefits, because it's a combination of things. So the obvious answer is that it's the development of technology that facilitates this broad take-up of digitalization that allows, so I'm obviously at the moment talking about distributed ledger technology, the ability to decentralize, which obviously then helps with DeFi, helps with different modes of governance, like, as you said, an autonomous organization. We just didn't really have that a decade ago, or at least not in a sort of mainstream and scalable way. So that's the obvious thing to say. But then I think there was another really, really significant factor, which I saw sort of happening, I guess we all sort of saw happening in real time. And that was the pandemic, because what the pandemic did, certainly from a lawyer's perspective, is it forced a lot of issues into the limelight, which I think lawyers would have been, certainly in England and Wales, would have been quite happy to leave alone for a lot longer if the the enforced physical separation of people hadn't made them think, well, actually, perhaps these things are better done in a digital way, because we already had that ability. But English lawyers, English private lawyers are, and I don't think this is any sort of revelation, are not that progressive. They're quite conservative with a small c. So, they're risk averse. And there's good things that come out of that. That's why English law is generally trusted around the world, because it doesn't change with the wind. But the downside of that, of course, is that if we're not careful, that we won't be able to accommodate the things that people just really, really want to do and now can do.
Yeah, it's a good point, really, because that it's always seen as like the UK leads the way in many aspects, and it actually leads me nicely on to this next topic. So for those that don't know, there's the Electronic Trade Documents Act, which was essentially passed through law not too far long ago, as of last year. This is something I tried to reiterate in a video that we covered on this, and Andre Carson at the time kindly came on the channel to discuss this in a bit more detail as well. That this isn't just something that you click your fingers and it's just done. This is something that transforms over time. There's a lot of thought process and development that goes on behind this, and especially from a legal stance, it's absolutely massive. So there's so many statistics and things that we threw out in that particular video, and in general what we talk about on the channel all the time. I guess like the sort of main focus, and something that you did really well at the TFDi event, I was very fortunate to attend and listen to yourself discussing that in a bit more detail. Can you explain a bit more, first of all, the Electronic Trade Documents Act? You don't have to go into full depth of that because we do have videos that support that, but I'm really interested, and I know the audience will be as well, about how that consultation process occurs, like how long that roughly takes in terms of timeframes, what were the kind of discussions around this, because we don't really get to see that as general public. We just see, if you research it, you can go onto the parliamentary websites and you can see a bill that's been in conversation or development of it, consultations, etc., and then it just becomes law. It'd be really cool to have a bit of an insight of like how that came about and how long did it take? All those kind of like interesting processes we never get to see on the outside.
Yeah, sure. So the Law Commission process is slightly different to how things get put into legislation if it's directly through a government department. So the important thing about the Law Commission is we are independent from government. So that's the underlying part of all of this, which is hugely significant, because we don't make we don't make legal recommendations that are in any way party political, and that's really why government commissions us to do things, because it takes any sort of political perspective out of it, because we're legal geeks, right? We just want law to be as modern, fair, and accessible as possible. So that's the first important point to note. Now, a Law Commission project takes around 18 months to 3 years. This one was closer to the 18 months mark because it was so time sensitive. So I've already talked about the pandemic, and I think that really did make it very clear that it was no longer possible or no longer really feasible to expect people to pass on paper documents physically from one party to the next, which unbelievably until September of last year was actually what needed to happen. Yeah. So it was a shorter version, but of course 18 months is still a fairly long time, particularly in the world of commerce. So what we did is, once government had given us the go ahead to do this project, is put together a consultation paper. Now, this was an area of law that I'd worked on for over a decade. Wow. So as a professor, so it was probably quicker in that sense, in that we already had a very good idea within the team of certainly what the problem was and what some suggested solutions would be. But the way a Law Commission consultation paper works is we actually consult even to put that paper together. So we check, it's not really about me as an academic saying this is what I think should happen, much as I would love to have done that. So we consulted and we listened to and talked to anyone who's interested. So I understand that the general public is probably not very aware of this, but as a matter of principle, anyone who wanted to come and talk to us was welcome to. And the consultations are open, but of course, as is probably inevitable, it tends to be specialists who do get in touch with us and who are interested enough to do that. So we put together provisional proposals in a consultation paper. Then we consult again, goes out for another period of consultation, which is about 3 months. And then we spend more than that analysing those responses and putting together our final recommendations to government. And that comes in the form of a final report. And with this, we also drafted the bill in-house. We have people called Parliamentary Council, who are the amazing experts who actually put all this stuff into the statutory language, which is an incredible skill. You know, they train for about 7 years. They're just amazing people. Anyway, so our team tells in-house Parliamentary Council, this is what we want the Act to do. They produce a draft bill, and that is then what goes into the parliamentary process. So all of that I've talked about, that was about 18 months to that point, from inception to then. And then the parliamentary process, we have a special law commission parliamentary process. So as I've said, the fact that it's law commission and therefore not politically contentious means that we can use a law commission special procedure. And essentially that means that most of the bill gets scrutinised in the House of Lords rather than the House of Commons, because it's more about intellectual integrity than it is about politics. Does have to go through the House of Commons, but more of the emphasis is in the House of Lords, which just makes it quicker. So we have a special public bill committee. And again, anyone is invited to give feedback to that. I was principal witness to that, which meant I was grilled about what the act is, or the bill as it was then, is supposed to do or intended to do. So that was quite good fun. What I would say about the process is it is still subject to the vagaries of parliamentary timetables. And I've said this before, I think it's probably in that sense one of the unluckiest bills, because certainly law commission bills, because we had, it spanned 2 monarchs.
Yes.
Three prime ministers, or maybe 4 prime ministers, I can't remember, and more Lord Chancellors than I've got fingers to count. So every time something like that happens, it stops the process and has to start again. So all in all, I think probably by the time we got to the enforcement of the coming into force of the Act, in September last year, it was about 2.25 years, which actually for legislation is not too bad. But then bear in mind that this Act is only 7 substantive sections long, so it's very short.
That's a really interesting point. And this is why I'm really pleased to have you on the channel, because there's just things that you don't really consider. That exact point of the different prime ministers, the different monarchy, and anything could change, right? If someone's policy changes or thought process changes, it could be out the window. I mean, that's absolutely incredible insight. I really appreciate that. I want to delve into 2 areas really. One probably more scoped towards, as you said earlier in this interview, about your background in coding, etc. I want to start really with the overall spectrum of digital assets. Now, we talk about this on the channel a lot, and I'm trying to drive into the audience about the mechanism, the real world asset implications that are coming, the tokenization of assets, and people still not necessarily, including myself in some areas, can't comprehend the aspect of digitalizing a potential physical asset or just a pure digital asset. And of course, there's been flexibility, for a better word, and I kind of take that word out of some of the consultation papers that I was reading by yourself and others within the commission. That word flexibility is quite a strong one, because there's so many law application for traditional law insinuations over many decades. But yes, it has accommodated certain aspects of digital asset ownership or property ownership with a digital format. But we're going into a sphere, exactly as you said, the last few years, I feel like has accelerated so much more. But the years to come is really showing a foundation that we have to have in place. And going back to that point about the UK trying to branch itself as being the leader of the world and people should follow. Yes, other countries might be ahead in certain instances and others, and vice versa. But when it comes to cryptography and blockchain adoption and utility, I know there's a lot more education aspect to still bring into this, but there's an article I read of yours on Forecast, and it looked into the question. The question, I'm going to read it out so I don't get it wrong. How can we claim to own something that falls outside traditional categories of personal property? And it was a great read. I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video. But within your consultations, like, and your overall thoughts around this area, because of the passion and dedication that you show on this, obviously, like, when those appropriations and consultations, I think they went through like June last year or something like this. What do you think the key steps moving forward are for the digital ownership aspect, but in the formality of, who's controlling this, who's creating legislation, the framework? How does that look, and what's being worked on at the moment? Because the aspect of digital ownership at the moment is skewed to in the sense of who actually owns this, or what's the legalities of this if someone is against the ownership of it, or who's owning what. It's quite a big thing, right? The legal tools aspect, the security of these crypto or these assets, it's a huge thing.
It is a huge thing, which is why eventually we were asked to do that project, which, and you're absolutely right, the final report for that, the digital assets project, as opposed to the ETDs one, we published the final report on June the 28th last year. So it's still fairly recent.
Yeah.
So how is that panning out? It's I think one of the things that's most interesting about the development of the law in relation to digital assets is that what's really important is that it develops, I think. I mean, you mentioned legislation in your question. For those who are listening who don't realise, apologies to those who do, but it is an important point, that the law of England and Wales has two main sources. So there is statute, there's legislation, which is what I think everybody knows, whether you're a lawyer or not. It's not always clear that a lot of our law comes from judicial decision making, so it's called common law, and that is really important for my answer, because what we recommended in that final report was that actually most of the development should be done through the common law. Why? Because the beauty of the common law is that it is responsive, it is sensitive, it can evolve a lot quicker. So I've just given you that example of the Electronic Trade Documents Act. Now that was quick, that was 2.5 years, that was quick. And that was quite unusual in that everybody wanted that to happen. There were a few disagreements around the edges of quite how it should be done, but everybody thought it should happen. It was a bit of a no-brainer. It still took 2.5 years, and we were lucky. And that was an expedited process. So if you have a longer, I mean, I think in the US, they've had sort of digital assets or blockchain acts that are 1,300 clauses long or sections long, and that, to get that through the parliamentary process, would not only be an almost impossible mission, but I'm not even sure it's worth the candle, because as soon as you put something in a statute, you ossify it, and it's then enshrined in that statute. Obviously, you can repeal statutes and you can replace them, but it takes a very long time. The common law, on the other hand, is a lot more nimble and a lot more agile. And so what we did in that report in 2023, let me get my years right, 2023, is that we gave the judges, the judiciary, a framework. We set out what the important points were about recognising things as property that haven't historically been recognised as property, because there are some judges who are very, very au fait with that, and others who are not. So we made it very clear why we thought that should apply, and then we handed the baton to them, really, and we did discuss this with them, and they were quite happy to do that. I think they agreed that it was the best way to do it, because if we made a statute now that said, along the lines of, if you have an asset that exists on DLT, and these are the following implications. Now, we all know that within 5 years, that's going to be obsolete. We're probably not going to be talking about DLT in the same exclusive way. So what was really important was the first principles. So what we said was, it's not really about, is this thing an NFT or is it a Bitcoin or whatever. What does it look like? What are its physical characteristics? And that is a lot more long lasting, because if a thing has certain characteristics, historically you could have said it about a horse or a bag of gold. Can you touch it? Can you pass it from one person to the next? Does that completely transfer it? And in terms of bags of gold and horses, yes, it does. If you can do that with a digital thing, if somebody can hold it and keep someone else from it and have that exclusive possession, well, that's what matters. It doesn't really matter that it's made of bits and bytes and not, well, whatever makes up a horse, like organs and fur and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't matter what it is, because if it has the same factual effect in the world, parties will use it in the same way. They'll have the same expectations, and the law will need to do the same thing. So what we said in the report was, this is how the common law should develop, by looking at these characteristics, by looking at first principles and the way parties use these assets. And the law then can develop in that way. And that's already happening. So when we first started the project 2.5 years ago, there wasn't really any case law. A lot of what we were saying was quite speculative. And then as the project went on, and certainly now we're in a very different position, case law has already moved on and answered a lot of these questions, which is, of course, great. So we're in a very different position now. And so, I mean, the short answer to your question, having given a very long preface to it, is that it's already working. So the common law is already responding to these, well, I keep saying new things. Of course, they're not that new anymore, but in relative terms, they are. The common law is already there. We do have one of the recommendations we did have, and this was actually at the request of the judges, was a very small, even shorter than ETDs, like one substantive, maybe two substantive clauses, digital asset statute that simply unlocks the law of property for digital assets and says, just because something is not a thing in action or a thing in possession doesn't mean it cannot be property. And then just, leave the common law to do its thing. So that's where we are. We haven't, we're in the process of drafting a bill for that statute, which we hope won't take very long. So I'm hopeful for the first half of 2024 for that. But of course, like any of our recommendations, we can only turn it over to government, and then it's in the hands of government. So I can make no guarantees, but that's where we are.
Oh, that's brilliant, Sarah. I want to touch into smart contracts, and this probably delves into more of your background specifically, as you mentioned about the coding development aspect. So smart contracts, in Europe in particular, I know there's a lot of laws or so bills in that instance going through at the moment around the usage of artificial intelligence, blockchain in general, the incorporation of IoT, all of these things, and there's still no cohesive answer to any of it yet. But I know that the UK is doing some really interesting moves in this particular area. For me personally, like smart contracts, they're almost a bit of a glue, really. Like you just mentioned about the Trade Act, and also, of course, digital assets in general, and predominantly within blockchain, smart contract, where you mentioned about these individual parts of something not necessarily being fully appropriate to decision making and law, etc. But of course, with the aspect of like legal documentation, which is infused within these kind of smart contracts. I always remember, like at university, like I used to have the law book, and I was in marketing, but we still had to understand some principles of like marketing, advertising law. So I know, like, to get through this or like understand the potential cases, or as you said earlier, the speculative aspects of things that might pop up, it can be sometimes like quite difficult. What do you think like needs to happen like moving forward for peers within your sector that you work in, the government in general, public knowledge, commercial level knowledge? What do you think needs to be done like moving forward in terms of like understanding this technology more and what the implications might be for these companies? So let's say a company might be entering the phase of developing their system, whatever that might be, whether it's supply chain management, for CRM, whatever it might be, and they're utilizing or going to be utilizing blockchain technology for verification, for transparency, the processing, the smart contract aspect. What do you think needs to be done here, and that implication as well of law? Because not many people or companies, some instances, still to this day, kind of think, oh, I'm going to do this, but I haven't really thought about what if this happens and I need to do some form. I know they could obviously hire a lawyer and everything, but when companies do their due diligence, they tend to think about these kind of things in advance. What do you think could be done better or needs to be done in that area, especially things like real estate, physical assets that we just discussed? There's a magnitude of sectors here and a lot of monetary value as well, so it becomes a really important topic.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problem is, and I've seen this with several of our reports, and it's inevitable. It doesn't surprise me at all, because it's human nature to resist unfamiliar risks. When we were doing the consultation, certainly for electronic trade documents, as I've said earlier, there was very little objection to that. But the little objection there was, well, it's, we feel insecure having these electronic documents because, what happens, and this is the one I heard the most often, what happens if the server goes down and we lose these documents? Well, that could happen, and paper could be thrown away or get wet, or so basically the aggregate risks, I think, with digitization are lesser than they are with conventional almost everything, but of course they're different. And as I've just said, I think we are, as humans, we are risk averse when it comes to unfamiliar risks. So it's all very well for me to say, but I think at root what needs to happen is we collectively just need to familiarize ourselves with these new risks, take the leap. Now, I also understand and recognize that it's all very well for larger organizations to do that because they've got the resources, they can take those risks and they can mitigate those risks. And of course, SMEs can't necessarily do so. I don't think none of the legislation that we've suggested and none of the changes that we've suggested in this jurisdiction are in any way mandatory. And we were very, very careful to make sure that was clear, that we are just here to facilitate those people who want to use these new processes, and we're certainly not going to demand it. So I think there is something to be said for letting the big guns make the mistakes, and to learn from those. And that's happened throughout technology's evolution, as far as I'm aware. But I think being open-minded, there's also quite a few sandboxes that are available now, which I think are a fantastic way of finding one's way around these technologies and their implications and their risks. But I think, it just has to be eventually biting the bullet, grasping the nettle, whatever metaphor you want to use. There's no getting away from that, really, I don't think, because it will get to the point fairly soon. And again, this is something that I've seen change very quickly over the time I've been at the Law Commission, even, which, as I said, is sort of getting on for 5 years, is that it's gone from being, and when I say it, I mean autonomous activities, corporate activities, commercial activities. That has gone from being that is something that is quite speculative and quite niche, for want of a better word, to being something that's now really so mainstream that the people and organizations who are not on board are in danger of missing out. So to a large extent, I think it has already happened. But the other difficulty, as I've already said, is I think lawyers are particularly risk averse. And of course, that's sort of their job, you might argue. So I think, but there's so many publications now. It's not just the Law Commission. There's the UKJT that you've already mentioned. There's lots of European publications. There's some fantastic books that have come out recently. I think there has been a real sea change in the last 2 years in the amount of available reassuring literature and reassuring thought leadership that I think people can embrace and follow. I think, the last 5 years has been amazing. I hoped that we would get to where we are now this quickly, but to be honest, I didn't really think we would. So it's been a pleasant surprise.
Keep that point in your mind, because this leads on to the last topical question here. The coming years, obviously, there's so much going on. We've talked about, arguably small areas here compared to the whole big spectrum of what's to come and what is still being talked about that some people just simply don't know yet until it comes into a bit more fruition. And by the way, for everyone out there, we will leave links to some of these consultation papers. They're absolutely fascinating, albeit though I think the smart contract one was about 200 odd pages on there. I don't think everyone will read every single word of it, but if you want some extra detail,
there are summaries on the website.
Exactly. So you can pinpoint that. It's really, really informative. But it leads me to this point. Your thoughts really on what are we expecting in the coming years, around regulation, legislation, compliance, all these aspects towards the things that we talked about and things that are to come. And you mentioned that you're happy with where everything is at the moment. Do you think the UK as a whole, whether it's governmental or just in general of this technological advancement that we're moving into with the likes of blockchain, etc. Do you feel that we are in a good position? Do you feel where we are where we should be? And what do you think is like the expectation moving forward and the things that we could maybe anticipate for these years to come? Because I think, there's talk of stable coins, CBDCs, as we said, real world assets, real estate's really formulating itself around this area. What do you think at the moment where we are with this? And do you think with the innovation hub and everything, that we're in a good stance to really lead this kind of, well, let's say a project, but this initiative, for a better word, for the rest of the world?
Yes and no. Yes, in terms of, I think the private law issues, so the things that I've talked about so far, do we recognize these things as being property? So do parties, whether they're commercial parties or individual parties, do they get the protection that they legitimately expect and they do expect for these things? I think we've done really well on that, and I do think we're ahead of the curve. There's probably us and Singapore with comparable approaches to that. So when I said we're in a great place and we're further forward than I expected, that's what I meant for that. And that's undeniably a very good thing. Where I think we are not ahead of the curve and probably at the moment behind the curve, although we do have a fairly good track record of catching up quite quickly. But that, you mentioned regulation. And I think in terms of regulation, so, what does the state, what restrictions and limitations does the state put on these private transactions, or what does it set out as the boundaries of what people and organizations can do with them? I think that's where we need the most focus, and I know that is happening. I know that that's in train at the moment, so it's certainly something that we are looking at. When I say we, by the way, I mean we as a jurisdiction. It's not the Law Commission's bag. It's sort of FCA, Bank of England, those sorts of institutions. And I know they're on it. It's very difficult because, I think everybody listening to this, I'm sure, is aware of what's happening across the globe, and particularly with the SEC and other jurisdictions where these assets have been arguably regulated out of the existence that the parties using them want them to have. And that's because they look, go back to my point about something that looks very different, even though it behaves in the same way. So that I have been party to some of these discussions as an observer and a contributor to discussions. And I think what's really important is that those bodies that regulate, and so essentially tell these organizations what they can and can't do, need to recognize that, again, it's not about the thing, it's about the behavior, how people treat the thing and how people use the thing, because that's what's really important. And, there's a lot of skepticism, or certainly there was in the wake of the collapse of FTX and, a few other catastrophes of last year. But the point is, that's happened so many times throughout history. That wasn't an intrinsic part of it being crypto and being this cryptographically secured thing. That was about the behavior in relation to it. And I think that's the really important key that I think is fairly well recognized now, but it certainly wasn't at the inception. So yes and no. I think private law transactions, we're in a really good position. I think regulation, we've got some way to go, but I also think that the signs on that are very promising.
That's awesome. Well, Sarah, that has brought us to the end of this interview conversation. Absolutely fantastic. The insight is incredible. There's things I'd love to branch off into other videos. I'd absolutely love to have you on the channel again in the near future, because there's always one of those things. It's opening the box, isn't it? There's so many areas and so many paths this goes down. As you said, a lot is speculative. A lot of it is being worked out. But we know, like, there's a bit of hindsight in our minds as to what is coming. And the fact that you mentioned as well that, the UK yourselves are planning, that's all that people can ask for, really, because, the planning is an incentive part, that it's not just something that's just thrown at us and we need to react to it. Of course, that comes along, but it's been fascinating to talk to you, and I absolutely loved this conversation. I know the audience is going to love it as well. But thanks so much for coming on the channel. And as I said, I'd love to have you back on as soon as you're ready to.
Yeah, pleasure. Well, I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So whenever you want me.
That's brilliant, Sarah. I hope I'll see you at some events in the near future. But thanks again for your time.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, everyone, hopefully you enjoyed that video. Absolutely massively insightful. There's just so many things going on in my head now about other different videos that we can do. Hopefully we'll have Professor Sarah back on the channel as soon as we can, especially as we see these developments occurring over the next few years. There's a lot of topics that we went through, and it was just great to branch out into all these different areas of interest within what they're building, what they're advising on. And some really key critical points here, especially. I don't want to orientate it too much around the UK. I know we've spoken about the UK a lot, but there is this formality, maybe over a century, maybe longer, where the world looks to the UK for legislative aspects. I don't know whether that's mainly from the experience perspective, or we tend to do the due diligence very well, and many will follow this with their own, remitted or reformed aspects of what's being built or discussed, or indeed converted into law eventually in those respectable countries worldwide. And I think certainly, as we mentioned towards the end of that video, 2024 I think is going to be a huge year of developments. We talked about like stablecoins, central bank digital currencies, of course, huge areas of interest. Real world assets is going to be a huge topic on everyone's lips throughout the next few years for sure. And there's just that aspect of not necessarily the unknown. I think a lot of it's on paper, it's being thought about, and that's exactly the point that Sarah made. Is the important thing is that these things are being discussed and they're being thought about already. Whether or not they have transitioned into a formality of law is another question, but they're certainly working towards that. And that's where the commissioning aspect really helps towards driving the advice and the ultimate end goal, the end result for all of these areas. So I'm hoping that you guys learned something today. I know I did. Just simple points that I didn't even really think about. I mean, some of these legislations or things that have turned into acts or law, of course, have superseded so much that's gone on in this country over the last few years. And if those that do or don't understand the process of things passing through from bill to act format to law is usually a long, extensive process. Not huge amounts of years, but if you think of all the different things that have gone on over the last 3-4 years, it's quite substantial. And a lot of that does refer to what's been going on around the world as well. So I just think that this whole compliance regulatory aspect is a huge topic. Everyone's talking about it all the time, and they're wondering why has this not been done yet. But the fact is that this has been talked about for a long time already. Just some of the dates that are thrown out in this video. Some of these documents that I'll leave links to, they go back to 2019. Some of them even later than that. Some have been talked about 10-12 years ago, when blockchain officially was kind of roughly initiated into the world, from 2008 onwards, as it were. So there's lots to come, but I think that the main thing is getting insight on these areas. So we as investors, we as people who are generally excited and interested about these topics and these sectors, to understand what's coming. And understand that there's so much more to work out. And that's why it's so exciting in my head, because it is new, it's in development still. There is arguably, there is a right and wrong, of course, how things should be done in the crypto space. We've seen elements of that. It was mentioned about FTX as an example, for example, overall. There's many different cases where we can improve upon things. But the ultimate thing is that you could argue the blockchain space is still in that immature level, or that immature area. It hasn't matured yet at all. We're still in development. We're still in adoption stages. Can you imagine what it's going to be like in 5-10 years? And these are the stepping stones that need to be in place for us to progress. And as I said, absolutely delighted to have Sarah on the channel. I'm looking forward to having her on again. But if there's any other topics or things that you want to discuss or have interviews with, or any companies in particular, just give us a shout out in the comments below. But yeah, for sure, any future interviews we always mention on the community section of the channel. We try and give you advance warnings, so if there's any questions or topics that you want answered, feel free to chuck them in. That's what this channel is about, is education, sharing of knowledge, and getting us ready. We're getting ready for a big number of years ahead of us in the crypto and blockchain space, and for sure this element that we've discussed today is a big part of that as well. So thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next interview video. Take care. Bye-bye.